In the coldest reaches of the galaxy, there was a world known as Nethra, a planet covered entirely in ice. A place where the sun hardly pierced through the thick clouds, and its surface was an endless landscape of frozen wasteland. Yet, to the brave few who dared to venture, it was a place of extreme tests, an opportunity to prove one's survival skills beyond the ordinary. Ella Torvin, a young cadet from the planet Veres, had always been drawn to the cold. Growing up in the temperate, green plains of Veres, she had often heard stories about the more inhospitable places of the universe. But Nethra? It was different. Nethra had been calling to her, a challenge like no other. Now, here she was. The metal door of the transport shuttle slid open with a sharp hiss, and the bitter wind rushed in like a flood of icy needles. Ella's breath fogged up her visor as she stepped into the snow. The landscape stretched endlessly, the ground a dull white under the overcast sky. It was a place where no human, or any sentient species, was meant to thrive. Yet, Ella had signed up for this test willingly. This survival challenge was one of the toughest on the Academy's roster, and she was determined to prove herself. As she stepped off the shuttle and onto the thick sheet of ice beneath her boots, Ella realized how immediately dangerous Nethra could be. The cold seeped into her bones within moments, her thermal suit struggling to maintain a comfortable temperature. But Ella didn't flinch. She was here for a reason, to survive, adapt, and maybe, just maybe, meet someone who could challenge her in ways she couldn't imagine. Her first few steps were shaky, as the ice beneath her cracked slightly with each stride, but she pushed on. The other cadets were already moving into their positions, some effortlessly navigating the harsh conditions, while others were hesitating. Ella quickly scanned the faces of the others, noticing the cool demeanor of Thorn, another cadet from the planet Wraith. Thorn had a reputation for being a lone wolf, always working alone, and it seemed like he was already preparing to enter a defensive stance, folding his arms as he set his gaze on the horizon. "Focus," she muttered to herself, tightening the straps of her pack and forcing herself to walk forward with purpose. She was here to prove herself, not to watch others. Ahead, she could see the other cadets, the Zilks, were already dropping to the ground, a few rolling themselves up in the snow as their bodies naturally adjusted to the cold. Their bodies had evolved to survive extreme environments, making them perfect candidates for these kinds of tests. Ella had no such biological advantages. No, she was simply human. Her people's adaptability was legendary, but it was more of a myth than a proven fact. That's why she had volunteered for this test. To show that her species could, indeed, adapt. Ella's goal was simple: survive the next 72 hours without resorting to the other cadets' methods. She refused to sleep in hibernation or use any of the pre-established techniques that other species relied on. Humans, she believed, were more than capable of surviving in environments like this. She just needed to prove it. The first hurdle was obvious: finding shelter. In a place like Nethra, there was no room for complacency. The temperature was already dropping, the wind kicking up stinging ice particles that lashed at her face. Her breath came in short gasps as she trudged forward. Her eyes darted around, looking for anything that could serve as a windbreak or shelter. There were only jagged rock formations in the distance. Nothing substantial, nothing to guarantee warmth. With her survival instincts kicking in, Ella pressed on, moving toward the nearest outcrop, her movements careful to avoid slipping. Halfway there, she noticed something: piles of discarded skin shells from the large native species of Nethra. They were thick, rigid, and translucent, lying abandoned in the snow, glimmering like forgotten armor from some long-dead creature. Ella stopped. There was no sign of the creatures, but she knew what these husks were. The creatures of Nethra shed their outer layers before hibernating, leaving behind a material that was remarkably insulated. It was the perfect resource, and she would need it to survive. Without hesitation, she approached one of the discarded shells. The material was warm to the touch, insulated by the natural properties of the species' unique biology. Ella's heart raced with excitement and desperation. This could work. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She began to drag the husks together, her fingers numb and stiff with the cold. Each movement sent jolts of pain through her limbs, but Ella pressed forward. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. She had to move fast if she was going to survive the night. As the wind howled around her, Ella quickly piled the shells together and used the straps of her survival pack to secure them in place. The makeshift structure was rudimentary, but it would be enough to shield her from the worst of the storm. Inside, it wasn't warm by any means, but the temperature was noticeably better. The frost on her visor began to melt, her body slowly adjusting to the improved conditions. For the first time since stepping out of the shuttle, Ella allowed herself to breathe deeply, calming her racing pulse. She sat on the cold floor, huddling into herself. There was no fire, no advanced technology, just the cold, the wind, and the layers of molted shell stacked high around her. Tomorrow, she would need to reinforce the shelter, find more resources, and, most importantly, try to conserve her energy. She had made it through the first few hours. But would she be able to survive the next 72? The moon of Nethra glowed dimly overhead, casting a blue-gray light over the frozen landscape. Inside her shelter, Ella closed her eyes, exhaustion creeping over her. She wasn't sure if it was sleep or the sheer force of will that kept her awake, but she didn't close her eyes fully. Not yet. Not while she was still fighting to stay alive. The next morning came slowly. Ella woke to the sound of the wind howling outside her crude shelter. She could feel the cold seeping through the layers of her makeshift walls. It wasn't enough to freeze her solid, but the sting of the cold was relentless, gnawing at her like an uninvited guest. Her body ached from the stress of the previous day, but she had no time for rest. The survival challenge had only just begun. She crawled out of the shell-made shelter and took a deep breath of the frigid air. The sky was still a dull gray, and the winds were stronger now, carrying with them the sharp bite of frost. She quickly checked her survival pack, still there, still intact, but she knew it wouldn't be enough for the long haul. The cadets who'd volunteered for this challenge were usually well prepared, but the supplies they brought were limited. Nethra had a way of stripping away even the most meticulous plans. Ella tightened the straps on her thermal suit, adjusted her gloves, and took one last look at the shelter she had built. It wouldn't stand up to another night, that much was certain. If she wanted to survive, she had to keep moving. The horizon was a bleak expanse of ice and snow, with no landmarks in sight. Still, she needed to find food. The challenge was as much about endurance as it was about resourcefulness. A human could go without food for some time, but Ella knew the limits of her body. She needed to find something to sustain her, something that would give her the energy to push through the unforgiving landscape. She had seen some of the native creatures' tracks from the previous day, large, quadrupedal forms that left deep, wide impressions in the snow. But the creatures had all but disappeared. In a place like this, even the most tenacious predators knew when it was time to lie low. Ella decided to move westward, towards what appeared to be a distant mountain range. If she could find any natural resources, water, animals, or perhaps even some remnants of other expeditions, it would be her best bet for survival. The cold wind bit at her face as she began her trek. With each step, the exhaustion from yesterday's exertion made itself known, but she refused to slow down. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the night she spent alone in the shelter. The eerie silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind, had been enough to make her question her sanity. But there was no turning back now. The mountains were still a long way off, but as Ella trudged on, she caught sight of something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There, through the swirling snow, she saw a figure. A person. Her first instinct was to run toward them, her mind racing with questions. Was it another cadet? Had they been sent to assist her, or was it part of the test to see how she would handle another person in such a dangerous environment? But then her mind clicked. She had heard about the survival tests on Nethra. Some cadets were sent with partners, but others were left alone. If she had been left alone, as she suspected, then this person might not be here to help. The figure seemed to be moving with a purpose, their movements sharp and deliberate. Ella squinted through the snowstorm, trying to make out more details. It was difficult to see in the heavy flurries, but the figure appeared to be wearing a similar survival suit to hers. Their helmet, too, was covered in a frosty layer, their visor obscured by the snow and ice. She couldn't make out their features, but there was something about the way they moved, confident, purposeful, like they had been here before. Was this a fellow cadet? Or something else entirely? Ella took a deep breath, gathering her courage. If she was to survive, she couldn't be afraid of the unknown. Stepping forward, she moved towards the figure, her steps cautious but steady. "Hey," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond immediately, continuing to move in the same direction. Ella frowned. Maybe they hadn't heard her. She increased her pace, catching up to the person and stepping in front of them. "Hey," she shouted again, louder this time. "I'm not here to fight, I just want to know if you're all right." The figure stopped abruptly, the snow swirling around them in a thick cloud. For a moment, there was silence, just the howling wind and the cold, oppressive air. Then the figure slowly turned to face her. Ella froze. She had expected to see the familiar face of a cadet, someone from her training group, but what she saw instead was something else entirely. The person standing before her was tall, lean, and built for survival. His thermal suit was slightly different from hers, sleeker, more advanced, like something designed for a more experienced survivor. But what truly caught her attention were his eyes. Underneath his frosted helmet, there was a certain intensity that she couldn't ignore, a sharpness, a coldness. His gaze bore into her like he was already assessing her, evaluating whether she was a threat or a potential ally. Ella didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. The figure didn't speak, just stood there, sizing her up. "You're not from my group, are you?" she asked, trying to break the silence. Her heart raced in her chest. Something about this man felt different. Dangerous, even. He cocked his head slightly, as if considering her words. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "No. I'm not." His response was short and cryptic, and it only raised more questions. "Then what are you doing out here?" Ella asked, her curiosity growing. She took a cautious step forward, trying to gauge his reaction. The man didn't move. Instead, he simply glanced around, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. "You're not the first to ask that question," he said, his tone flat. "But if you're smart, you'll stop asking and start surviving. The longer you talk, the harder it will be to make it out here." Ella felt a chill run down her spine. His words were cryptic, but they were also loaded with an unspoken warning. For the first time since stepping foot on Nethra, Ella felt truly uncertain. Was this man another cadet? Or was he something more? Something unknown. She glanced at the ground, noticing faint tracks leading off into the distance. Whatever he was, he clearly knew how to navigate this harsh landscape. Before she could respond, the man took a step back. "If you're serious about surviving," he said, his gaze flicking to the north, "you'll want to follow me." Without waiting for her response, he turned and began to walk away, his figure disappearing into the snowstorm. Ella hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she should follow. But something told her she couldn't afford to be left alone out here, not with the winds picking up and the cold seeping deeper into her body. She took one last look at the barren, ice-covered world around her before making her decision. She followed. The snowstorm intensified as Ella trailed behind the mysterious figure, her every step an effort to keep up with his brisk pace. The wind howled with a fury, whipping at her face, but she couldn't stop, not yet. The man had seemed so confident, so sure of his movements, like he belonged to the unforgiving landscape. His eyes had been cold, calculating, but there was a flicker of something else too, something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps he saw her as weak, or maybe he was testing her resolve. Whatever his reasoning, she had no choice but to follow. She needed to survive, and in that moment, he was her best chance. The man moved through the snow as if it was second nature, his movements swift and precise. Ella, on the other hand, stumbled occasionally, the exhaustion from yesterday's work weighing heavily on her body. Her legs were sore, her head foggy with fatigue, but she forced herself to push through. She didn't want to show weakness, not to him, not to anyone. After what felt like hours, they reached the base of a steep ridge, where the wind seemed to die down slightly. The air was colder now, and Ella's breath came out in visible clouds, but the chill wasn't as biting here. The ridge was covered in a thick blanket of snow, dotted with jagged rocks that protruded like the bones of some ancient, frozen creature. It was a desolate place, more inhospitable than any place she'd seen so far, but the man didn't stop. Instead, he walked toward a narrow gap in the rocks, almost hidden from view. Ella followed, her heart thudding in her chest. The moment she entered the gap, she found herself in a small, sheltered area. The wind didn't reach here. The cold, though still present, was more manageable. And as she looked around, she realized it wasn't just shelter from the storm that made this place unique, it was the strange markings on the walls of the rocks. Carved into the stone were symbols. Complex, intricate designs that almost looked like an ancient language, one that she had never seen before. There was something about the carvings that made her skin prickle, an unexplainable sense of foreboding hanging in the air. The man seemed unfazed by them, walking over to a small campfire that had been set up in the center of the sheltered area. Ella stopped at the edge of the campfire, watching him closely as he bent down and began adding wood to the flame. It was clear now that he had prepared for this. He had been here before, knew exactly how to survive in this place. His movements were deliberate, methodical. As he worked, he glanced over at her, his eyes cold but calculating. "You should take a seat," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "The fire's strong enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay, but it won't last forever." Ella hesitated but eventually sat down, her legs sore from the journey. She leaned close to the fire, letting the warmth seep into her frozen limbs. The silence between them was heavy, each of them lost in their thoughts. Ella's mind was racing. Who was this man? And why had he chosen to lead her here? There was no way this was just an ordinary survival test. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke up. "Why did you bring me here?" Her voice was careful, probing. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he added another log to the fire and adjusted the angle of his seat, as if settling in for a long conversation. "This place is safe," he said finally. "For now. The storm won't last forever, but when it clears, the real danger begins." Ella furrowed her brow. "What danger?" He turned to face her fully, his gaze steady and unnerving. "You'll see soon enough. Nethra doesn't care about your survival. It doesn't care about the test. If you're not careful, it'll swallow you whole. And there's more to this place than you realize." Ella felt a shiver run through her, but she held her ground. "More? What do you mean?" He was silent for a moment before answering, his voice lower now, more serious. "You're not the first to come here, and you won't be the last. This isn't just a survival challenge. It's a test of something far greater, something no one talks about. Some come here for answers, some come for escape. But Nethra has its own rules, its own secrets. And if you don't learn them quickly, you won't make it out." Ella stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. She had been briefed on the survival training, of course. But this was something else entirely. There was something about his tone, the way he spoke, that made her question everything she thought she knew. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He met her gaze, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker behind his icy eyes. Then, it was gone, replaced with a guarded expression. "I'm someone who's been through this before," he said, his tone final. "And I'm still here." The fire crackled between them, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more to this situation than he was letting on. She had known from the moment she stepped onto Nethra that this wasn't just about surviving the elements. But she hadn't expected it to be like this, mysterious, dangerous, and, most unsettling of all, filled with people like this man, who knew far more than they were willing to reveal. Ella felt a rush of frustration, but she didn't show it. The last thing she needed was to appear weak. Instead, she focused on the fire, the warmth, the rhythm of the flames as they consumed the logs. There was something oddly comforting about it, even as it fueled her unease. The man didn't speak for a while, leaving Ella alone with her thoughts. The silence between them stretched on, filled only by the occasional crack of the fire. But then, just as Ella thought she couldn't take it anymore, he spoke again. "You'll need to learn the rules, Ella," he said, his voice grave. "The rules of this place. There's no going back once you've made the decision to stay. The question is, are you ready for that?" Ella's heart beat faster as she turned to face him. His eyes were unwavering, studying her like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "I've come this far. I'm not turning back now." The man nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that answer. Then he stood up, brushing snow from his suit as he began to gather his belongings. "Good," he said simply. "Then get some rest. Tomorrow, we start." Ella's mind raced, but she obeyed, settling back into her spot by the fire. She was unsure of what lay ahead, of what she had just committed herself to. But there was no turning back. She had to keep moving forward. The fire crackled, and in the distance, the wind howled louder than ever. But for the first time since she had stepped foot on Nethra, Ella felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't alone in this after all. The morning after their uneasy campfire conversation, Ella awoke to the sharp bite of cold. The wind had died down, but the sky remained a deep, unyielding gray, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath. She shifted, stretching her stiff limbs as the remnants of sleep clouded her thoughts. The fire had burned low, leaving behind only embers that glowed faintly against the surrounding snow. The man had already risen. He stood a few feet away, his back to her, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he were anticipating something. Ella couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency in his movements, a quiet tension in the way he held himself. She had grown accustomed to his silence, but this was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet foreboding that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She stood and moved toward the fire, trying to shake off the lingering effects of exhaustion. As she stoked the embers, she looked around. They were in a hollowed-out section of the ridge, a place so hidden by the terrain that it would be almost impossible for anyone to find unless they knew exactly where to look. It was both a blessing and a curse, safe, but isolating. "Are you ready?" The man's voice broke through her thoughts, calm but firm. Ella turned to face him. He had been watching her closely, as though gauging her readiness for something. She met his gaze, determined not to show any signs of doubt. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady. The man nodded, his eyes briefly narrowing as if he were evaluating the sincerity of her words. He didn't say anything more, just motioned for her to follow him. Ella hesitated for a moment, gathering her things, her pack, the last of her rations, and the tools she had been given for survival. Once ready, she trailed behind him, her boots crunching in the thick snow as they began their trek. As they moved through the ridge's narrow paths, Ella couldn't help but notice how different this place felt compared to the rest of the wilderness. The air was still cold, but there was something more oppressive here, as though the very land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The carvings on the rock walls, still visible in the pale light, seemed to grow more intricate the deeper they went, the symbols twisting and curling into patterns that made her uneasy. "Do you know what these markings mean?" she asked, unable to hold back the question any longer. The man's pace didn't slow, but his eyes flickered toward her, his expression unreadable. "No one truly knows," he said, his voice low. "Some say they're warnings. Others believe they're a map. But no one has ever been able to decipher them completely. They're as old as the land itself. Ella absorbed his words in silence, her mind turning them over. A warning? A map? She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to everything she was searching for were hidden in these markings, if only she could understand them. After several hours of walking, the terrain began to change. The ridges grew steeper, the snow deeper, and the wind seemed to bite with a new intensity. The man led her toward a series of boulders that jutted out from the ground like ancient teeth, forming a jagged archway. The air around the archway felt colder, somehow sharper. "This is it," he said, stopping at the entrance. The first trial. Ella stared at the archway, feeling a mixture of anticipation and dread rise within her. She had heard about the trials, tests designed to push her to her limits, to break her down and rebuild her. But this? This felt different. She could feel the weight of something ancient, something far more powerful than anything she had anticipated. "What happens now?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. The man turned to face her, his gaze calculating. "You walk through," he said simply. "You don't look back. And whatever you do, don't make a sound." Ella blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean, don't make a sound?" "You'll understand soon enough," he replied, his voice grim. "Once you step through, the world will change. It will test you in ways you can't imagine. Your fears, your weaknesses, they will come to life. But if you make a sound, if you show even a hint of fear, you won't survive it." Ella's heart skipped a beat. This was beyond anything she had expected. But she had come this far, and there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she stepped forward. The moment she passed beneath the archway, the air around her seemed to change, darker, thicker, as though the world had shifted on its axis. She instinctively reached out for the rock, but as her fingers brushed against it, something strange happened. A shadow moved across the stone. It wasn't just the play of light, it was as if something was there, something she couldn't see, but could feel. A voice, cold and distant, whispered in her ear. "Welcome, Ella. Welcome to your trial." Her heart raced as she turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The world around her remained still, the snow silent, the wind non-existent. She could hear her breath, ragged and uneven, but the quiet was almost suffocating. "Don't make a sound," the man's words echoed in her mind. Ella swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She could feel the presence, an oppressive weight pressing against her chest, but she forced herself not to react. Not to move. The longer she stood there, the more the air seemed to grow thicker, the darkness around her deeper. And then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. Fear, betrayal, doubt, the words echoed in her mind, familiar yet alien at the same time. Ella clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as the whispers swirled around her. She could feel them digging into her thoughts, unearthing her deepest fears. Memories of her past, failures, mistakes, regrets, flashed before her eyes. Faces of people she had lost, choices she wished she could take back, all of it resurfacing in a torrent of anguish. "No," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. But even that small sound seemed to trigger something. The darkness around her began to pulse, as though the very air was alive, thrumming with energy. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she felt herself falling, her body plunging into the unknown. In the split second before she hit the ground, Ella understood. The trial wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about the mind, about surviving the darkness within. And she had failed. But even as the cold, relentless darkness swallowed her whole, she refused to let herself scream. She couldn't. Not now. Not ever.